24th of August, 1942. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sun-baked steppe as Oberst Heinrich von Kleist pressed his field glasses against his weathered face. Before him stretched the industrial sprawl of Stalingrad, its factories belching defiant smoke into the hazy sky just 4 miles distant. His Panzer Regiment, the vanguard of General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army, had clawed through 600 miles of Soviet territory in a remorseless summer offensive. Now, within touching distance of the Volga River and the city that bore Stalin's name, his Mark IV Panzers sat idle, their engines cooling in the oppressive heat. The silence was wrong. Von Kleist had spent 3 years hearing the steady rumble of diesel engines, the mechanical heartbeat of the Wehrmacht's armored fist. But this morning, that heartbeat had flatlined. His fuel gauges read empty. Every single tank in his command sat motionless, transformed from predator to prey by a logistical catastrophe that had been building for weeks. The German war machine, which had consumed nations with industrial efficiency, now found itself choking on its own success. The supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the endless Russian expanse, vulnerable to partisan attacks, administrative incompetence, and the simple mathematics of distance. According to military historians at the United States Army War College, the German advance to Stalingrad represented one of the most overextended operations in military history, with supply columns stretched across 900 miles of hostile territory. Inside his command tank, von Kleist reviewed the morning's dispatch with mounting dread. Army Group B headquarters acknowledged the fuel shortage but could promise no immediate relief. The trains carrying thousands of gallons of precious petrol were stranded 300 miles west, victims of Soviet bombing raids that had destroyed critical railway bridges. What fuel existed was being diverted to the Luftwaffe, whose aircraft required constant sorties to suppress Soviet artillery and troop movements. The Panzers, those steel monsters that had terrorized Europe, would have to wait. Hauptmann Franz Müller climbed onto von Kleist's tank, his face gray with exhaustion. Müller commanded the 2nd Company, 43 Panzers that now resembled an elaborate sculpture garden rather than a fighting force. "Colonel, the men are asking questions," Müller reported quietly. "They can see the city. They can hear the Soviet reinforcements arriving by the hour. Every moment we sit here, the defenses grow stronger." Von Kleist knew Müller spoke truth. Intelligence reports indicated that Soviet General Vasily Chukov was flooding Stalingrad with the 62nd Army, transforming every building into a fortress, every street into a killing ground. The Germans had achieved the impossible by reaching the Volga, but warfare operated on momentum, and momentum required fuel. Without it, Paulus's army would be forced to attack a fortified city on foot, abandoning the mobile warfare doctrine that had made the Wehrmacht unstoppable. Through his glasses, von Kleist watched Soviet soldiers digging trenches along the city's outskirts. They moved with desperate urgency, racing against time they likely thought they didn't have. They couldn't know that the German Panzers, poised like coiled vipers, had been defanged by empty fuel tanks. For 48 hours, the Germans would wait. 48 hours that would reshape the entire war. History would call it the turning point. Von Kleist called it a nightmare. 25th of August, 1942. Colonel Alexei Radomtsov stood in the basement headquarters of the Stalingrad Defense Committee, studying maps that showed German positions uncomfortably close to the city center. A decorated veteran of the Spanish Civil War, Radomtsov commanded the 13th Guards Rifle Division, currently boarding boats on the Volga's eastern shore. His orders were simple and suicidal: cross the river under German fire and reinforce the crumbling defense. What should have been a death sentence had transformed into something else entirely. The expected German armored assault hadn't materialized. Commissar Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's personal representative in Stalingrad, paced the confined space like a caged bear. "The fascists have stopped," he announced to the assembled officers. "Our reconnaissance reports their tanks haven't moved in 24 hours. Some mechanical problem, perhaps sabotage." His voice carried desperate hope. The Soviet leadership had been preparing to write off Stalingrad, to sacrifice the city in exchange for time. Now, inexplicably, time had been granted. Major Ivan Ludnikov, commander of the 138th Rifle Division, offered a different assessment. Comrade Commissar, our partisans report fuel convoy destructions along their supply routes. The German war machine consumes petroleum like a drunkard consumes vodka. Perhaps they've finally run dry. The room fell silent as officers contemplated this possibility. Could the vaunted Wehrmacht conqueror of France and tormentor of Moscow be vulnerable to something as mundane as logistics? British historian Anthony Beevor, in his comprehensive work on the battle, notes that Soviet intelligence initially dismissed reports of German fuel shortages as too fortuitous to be credible, suspecting instead an elaborate tactical deception. Rodimtsov understood that explanations mattered less than opportunities. "Whether they lack fuel or will, we must use these hours," he declared. "Every rifle we move across the Volga, every anti-tank gun we position, every mine we lay, these are gifts purchased with German hesitation." He pointed to the map's blue arrows representing his division's planned crossing. "We move tonight. The Volga becomes our shield and our highway." Across the city, Soviet workers transformed factories into fortresses. The tractor factory, which had produced agricultural equipment in peacetime and tanks in wartime, now became a defensive position. Workers welded steel plates to building facades, positioned machine guns in administrative offices, and dug communication trenches through assembly floors. The Red October steel factory similarly metamorphosed, its furnaces still running even as soldiers sandbagged positions among the blast furnaces. These were not soldiers by training, but workers, old men, and even women who understood that surrender meant enslavement or death. Senior Sergeant Yakov Pavlov received orders that reflected the desperate improvisation characterizing Soviet defense. His platoon would occupy a 4-story apartment building overlooking the central square, transforming it into an observation post and strong point. Pavlov, a decorated soldier from Novgorod, studied the building through binoculars. It offered commanding views of approach routes the Germans would inevitably use. "We'll make them pay for every meter," he promised his lieutenant. The 48-hour German pause became 48 hours of frantic Soviet preparation. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to fire horizontally at approaching tanks. Civilians dug anti-tank ditches with hand tools, working through the night under sporadic German artillery fire. Ammunition stockpiles, previously kept distant to avoid destruction, were distributed to forward positions. Snipers occupied hidden perches in ruins, ranging their rifles for the killing distances urban combat demanded. Lieutenant Anatoly Mereshko, tasked with coordinating artillery support, marveled at the transformation. "Yesterday we were preparing to evacuate," he told his battery commanders. "Today we're preparing to hold. The Germans have given us the impossible a chance." 25th of August, 1942, evening. Oberst Werner von Tippelskirch, chief quartermaster for the 6th Army, sat in his requisitioned farmhouse headquarters surrounded by ledgers that documented failure. A meticulous officer who had spent 2 decades managing military logistics, von Tippelskirch now confronted mathematics that refused to cooperate. His panzers required 8,000 gallons of fuel daily to maintain operations. His supply columns could deliver, at best, 4,000 gallons, and that assumed no partisan interference, no mechanical breakdowns, and perfect weather. Reality provided none of these mercies. The telephone on his desk rang with mechanical insistence. Von Tippelskirch already knew what the caller would demand: fuel for the stalled panzers. Every regimental commander, every division quartermaster, every staff officer wanted the same impossible thing. "Von Tippelskirch?" he answered wearily. "Colonel, this is General Paulus's headquarters." The voice belonged to Major Wilhelm Adam, operations officer for the 6th Army. "The general demands to know when the armor will resume movement. The delay is unacceptable." Von Tippelskirch resisted the urge to laugh bitterly. "Major, I command supply chains, not miracles. The fuel trains are stranded at Kalakondon. Soviet bombers destroyed the rail bridge at Chur. Repair crews estimate 3 days minimum before trains can resume." 3 days? Adams' voice rose an octave. "The Führer expects Stalingrad captured by September. 3 days allows the Soviets to reinforce indefinitely. Then perhaps the Führer should have considered logistics before ordering an advance across half of Russia," von Tippelskirch responded, immediately regretting his candor. Such statements bordered on defeatism, a crime Wehrmacht military police took seriously, but exhaustion had eroded his diplomatic filters. The line went silent for several heartbeats. "Colonel, I'll pretend I didn't hear that remark," Adam finally replied. "Find fuel. Rob other units if necessary. The armor must move." After disconnecting, von Tippelskirch studied his supply map. Alternative sources existed, theoretically. The 17th Army, operating south of Stalingrad, maintained fuel reserves, but withdrawing their petrol would immobilize them, creating vulnerabilities elsewhere. The Luftwaffe stockpiles were theoretically accessible, but practically forbidden. Hermann Göring would have anyone touching his aircraft fuel shot. That left one option, waiting for repairs to restore the supply line. Hauptmann Klaus Hartmann, von Tippelskirch's deputy, entered carrying another dispatch. "More good news, I presume?" Von Tippelskirch asked dryly. "Soviet partisans attacked a supply column near Morozovsk," Hartmann reported. 14 trucks destroyed, including 3 fuel carriers. The escorts reported the partisans used anti-tank rifles, very organized, very effective. Military historian David Glantz, in his analysis of Operation Blue, emphasizes that German planners consistently underestimated the logistical demands of deep operations into Russia, treating the vast distances as tactical rather than strategic obstacles. Von Tippelskirch added this loss to his ledger. The partisan war had evolved from nuisance to genuine threat. Soviet irregular forces now coordinated their attacks, targeting supply columns with intelligence suggesting they knew exactly which trucks carried fuel versus ammunition. Some suspected Soviet agents had infiltrated Wehrmacht administrative units, feeding information to partisan bands. Investigations proceeded slowly, hampered by the same stretched resources afflicting everything else. "Klaus, calculate our current stockpile," von Tippelskirch ordered. "Every drum, every canister, everything within 50 miles of the front." Hartmann worked through papers, his lips moving silently as he tallied figures. "Approximately 12,000 gallons, Colonel. Enough for one major operation, perhaps 36 hours of sustained combat. And if we split that between the Panzers, 18 hours of movement. Maybe less if they encounter serious resistance requiring maneuvering." Von Tippelskirch stared at the map. 18 hours of fuel to capture a city that intelligence suggested was rapidly becoming a fortress. The equation was impossible. 26th of August 1942. In the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia, the morning briefing descended into familiar chaos. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, presented situation maps showing the Sixth Army's positions outside Stalingrad. Hitler, who had been pacing the conference room with characteristic agitation, stopped abruptly when Halder mentioned the fuel delay. "Delay?" Hitler's voice carried the dangerous quiet that preceded eruption. "You're telling me our panzers sit idle within sight of their objective because of fuel?" Halder, a professional soldier increasingly horrified by Hitler's strategic meddling, chose his words carefully. "Mein Führer, the distances involved in Operation Blue have stretched our supply capabilities. The railway destruction at Chur has temporarily interrupted deliveries. Repairs are underway, temporarily," Hitler repeated mockingly. That word haunts German operations. "Temporarily stopped outside Moscow? Temporarily delayed at Leningrad. I ordered Stalingrad taken in August. We're running out of August." He jabbed a finger at the map. "The Volga must be cut. Stalin's prestige city must fall. The entire world watches to see whether Germany can deliver knockout blows or merely promising jabs." Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's compliant chief of staff, attempted deflection. "Mein Führer, the Luftwaffe reports excellent results supporting ground operations. Reichsmarschall Göring assures me that—" "Göring assures me of many things," Hitler interrupted. "He assured me the Luftwaffe could supply our forces at Demyansk. He assured me his fighters could stop British bombers over the Reich. Now he assures me about Stalingrad. I want assurances backed by results, not pretty words." Colonel Bernhard von Lossberg, a staff officer specializing in logistics, cleared his throat nervously. "Mein Führer, if I may offer perspective, the fuel shortage reflects fundamental mathematical realities. Our forces advance 600 miles. Each mile of advance requires coordinating extension of supply lines. The Soviet railway system uses different gauge tracks, requiring either track conversion or transshipment at gauge breakpoints. Both processes are slow and vulnerable to partisan interference. Hitler turned his glare toward von Lossberg. I don't pay you to recite problems, Colonel. I pay you to solve them. The panzers need fuel? Then commandeer trucks from every other unit? Strip rear area formations of every vehicle capable of carrying fuel drums. March infantry if necessary, but get those tanks moving. According to historian Ian Kershaw's extensive documentation of Hitler's wartime leadership, the Führer frequently dismissed logistical constraints as defeatist excuses, treating warfare as an extension of willpower rather than practical resource management. Halder recognized the futility of further argument. Hitler had immersed himself in operational minutiae while ignoring strategic reality. The Führer studied frontline maps obsessively, moving unit markers as though they were chess pieces rather than exhausted soldiers. He demanded impossibilities while dismissing professional military advice as timidity. The relationship between Hitler and his general staff had deteriorated into mutual contempt barely concealed by military formality. The order stands, Hitler declared. Stalingrad falls in August. General policy is to attack with whatever fuel exists. Urban combat requires less mobility than open warfare. The panzers can support infantry advances even with limited range, he turned to his adjutant. Draft an order to Paulus. Emphasize that the Führer expects immediate action. Emphasize that excuses are unacceptable. After dismissal, Halder walked the corridors with von Lossberg. He orders attacks as though commanding an orchestra, Halder muttered quietly. Point here, wave there, and beautiful music emerges. He doesn't understand that orchestras require instruments, trained musicians, and sheet music. We have soldiers without fuel, tanks without parts, and plans without logistical foundations. Will you tell him that? Von Lossberg asked. I told him that when we planned this offensive. He called me a pessimist. Halder's voice carried resignation. Now his optimism collides with Soviet resistance and Russian distances. The collision will destroy good soldiers who deserved better leadership. Von Lossberg nodded silently. Officers learned quickly that criticizing strategic decisions meant professional suicide. The Wehrmacht had become a machine executing increasingly irrational orders from a leader who confused determination with capability. But machines required fuel, and fuel existed far from where it was needed. The order went out that afternoon, attack regardless of logistics. General Paulus, reading the directive in his headquarters, understood its implication. He was being ordered to assault a fortified city with compromised supply lines and exhausted troops. Success was unlikely, failure was probable, but obedience was mandatory. 27th of August, 1942, dawn. Oberst von Kleist received the attack order with the grim acceptance of a professional soldier commanded to attempt the impossible. His panzers had received enough fuel for approximately 4 hours of operation, enough to reach Stalingrad's outskirts, but insufficient for sustained combat or retreat if things deteriorated. Army Command had stripped every nearby unit of fuel, creating this small allocation that represented desperation rather than strategy. Gentlemen, von Kleist addressed his company commanders, we attack at 0600 hours. Our objective is the tractor factory district. We'll advance with infantry support from the 71st Infantry Division. Fuel constraints require we reach objectives quickly or not at all. Once stationary, we become pillboxes? Questions? Hauptmann Müller, whose pessimism had deepened during the 48-hour delay, raised his hand. Colonel, intelligence reports indicate significant Soviet reinforcement. The defenses we would have faced 2 days ago no longer exist. We're attacking a prepared position with limited fuel, limited ammunition resupply, and no reserve capability if we encounter serious resistance. Your assessment is accurate, von Kleist acknowledged, which is why we attack immediately, before defenses become even stronger. The alternative is sitting here until Soviet counterattacks destroy us piecemeal. At precisely 6 o'clock, 40 German Panzers lurched forward, their engines roaring defiance at mathematics and logistics. Behind them, infantry companies advanced in textbook formation, seeking the protection mobile armor provided. The opening phase proceeded smoothly. Light Soviet resistance crumbled before the armored assault. Von Kleist allowed himself cautious optimism. Perhaps the Soviets hadn't used their reprieve as effectively as feared. Then they entered the suburbs. The street exploded. Anti-tank guns, carefully positioned in basement windows and behind rubble barricades, opened fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Muller's lead tank disintegrated in a fireball that sent shrapnel whistling past von Kleist's command vehicle. A second Panzer slewed sideways, its right track blown off by a mine the infantry scouts had somehow missed. Within 90 seconds, von Kleist's assault transformed from offensive to desperate survival. All units combat dispersal. Von Kleist barked into his radio. Suppressive fire on basement positions. Infantry, clear those buildings. But clearing buildings required time and fuel, both commodities in catastrophically short supply. German infantry, trained for open warfare on the Polish plains and French farmland, found themselves fighting room to room against defenders who knew every corner of their city. Soviet soldiers appeared from sewers, fired from behind walls that seemed solid, disappeared into basements that connected through underground passages. Research published by the Russian Ministry of Defense Archives reveals that Soviet defenders had spent their 48-hour reprieve mapping the urban terrain, prepositioning ammunition caches, and establishing interlocking fields of fire that turned entire city blocks into elaborate kill zones. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, commanding his strongpoint in the 4-story apartment building, watched the German attack with professional interest. His platoon had spent 2 days preparing this position, mining approaches, ranging weapons, and stocking ammunition. When the first Panzer appeared in his sight picture, Pavlov signaled his anti-tank riflemen. Center mass on my mark. Fire. The PTRD anti-tank rifle bucked savagely against its operator's shoulder, sending a 14mm tungsten core round through the Panzer's thinner side armor. The tank didn't explode cinematically, but instead ground to a halt, smoke seeping from vision ports as the crew bailed out under rifle fire. Pavlov's building, which would later bear his name in Soviet military history, had claimed its first victim. Von Kleist's fuel gauge dropped toward empty as his Panzer maneuvered through increasingly narrow streets. Every turn revealed new horrors: burning vehicles, wounded infantry without medics to treat them, officers shouting contradictory orders into radios that crackled with panic. The urban terrain negated every German tactical advantage. Panzers couldn't maneuver effectively in confined streets. Infantry couldn't advance without armor support. Artillery, the traditional solution to defensive positions, risked hitting friendly forces in the chaotic close-quarters combat. "Colonel, we must withdraw," Muller's voice crackled through the radio. "We've lost 8 tanks, maybe 12 infantry killed or wounded. Fuel will be critical in 30 minutes. Von Kleist wanted to argue, to insist on pressing forward, but military realism overruled pride. All units phased withdrawal. First company provides cover while second pulls back, then reverse. The retreat, organized and professional despite circumstances, nonetheless felt like defeat. They had advanced perhaps 1 mile into Stalingrad's suburbs before fuel, casualties, and Soviet resistance forced withdrawal to starting positions. That night, reviewing casualty lists by candlelight, von Kleist calculated the cost of Berlin's impatience: 11 panzers destroyed or disabled, 43 infantry dead, 97 wounded. Soviet losses were likely higher, but the Soviets controlled the city and could reinforce. The Germans controlled empty steppe and dwindling fuel supplies. 28th of August, 1942. General Friedrich Paulus stood in his command post studying reports that documented uncomfortable truths. His Sixth Army, which had rolled across southern Russia with mechanized efficiency, now found itself trapped in a logistical and tactical nightmare. The failed assault had consumed the Army's meager fuel reserves while accomplishing nothing except demonstrating Soviet defensive capability. Paulus was a staff officer by temperament and training, more comfortable with organizational charts than battlefield improvisation. He had been promoted to Army command partly due to competence, partly due to loyalty to the Nazi regime, and partly because more talented commanders had been killed, dismissed, or transferred. Now he commanded the largest German formation in Russia and confronted problems that organizational skill couldn't solve. The Führer demands explanation for yesterday's failure, reported Major Wilhelm Adam, reading from a decoded radio message. Berlin characterizes the attack as insufficiently aggressive and attributes the withdrawal to lack of will. We're instructed to renew the offensive immediately. Paulus removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. Berlin sits in comfortable offices and criticizes soldiers dying in Russian streets. How refreshing. The sarcasm felt good but changed nothing. Hitler's orders were absolute, regardless of battlefield reality. What's our current fuel situation? Oberst von Tippelskirch, summoned to provide the quartermaster's perspective, consulted his ever-present ledger. General, we have enough fuel for approximately one more limited offensive, perhaps 6 hours of armored operations. The rail bridge repairs at Chur are progressing, but won't be complete for another 48 hours minimum. After that, assuming no further partisan interference, we can expect regular deliveries resuming. Another 48 hours, Paulus repeated, during which the Soviets continue reinforcing. Intelligence reports suggest they're ferrying an entire Guards division across the Volga nightly. Every day we delay, the city becomes more formidable. According to historian William Craig's definitive account of the Stalingrad battle, German intelligence systematically underestimated Soviet reinforcement rates, partly due to wishful thinking and partly due to the Red Army's effective operational security regarding troop movements. Lieutenant Colonel Gunther Angern, the Sixth Army's intelligence chief, offered his assessment. General, we're facing an operational dilemma with no good solutions. We can attack now with insufficient fuel, which yesterday's results suggest will fail. We can wait for fuel resupply, which allows the Soviets time to strengthen defenses. Or we can request operational pause and strategic reassessment, which Berlin will reject as defeatism. So we're damned regardless, Paulus muttered. Attack and fail, wait and face stronger defenses. Or admit impossibility and face court-martial? He studied the map, searching for answers geography couldn't provide. Stalingrad stretched along the Volga's western bank, a city of over 400,000 people now transformed into a fortress. The Germans needed to capture it to secure the Volga crossing, protect the flank of Army Group A advancing toward the Caucasus oil fields, and satisfy Hitler's obsession with capturing the city bearing Stalin's name. There is one possibility, suggested Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a Luftwaffe liaison officer attending the conference. The Luftwaffe can provide close air support during the next assault. We'll flatten buildings, suppress anti-tank positions, and provide reconnaissance. Gring has authorized maximum effort for Stalingrad operations. Paulus considered this. Air support was valuable, but not decisive in urban warfare where front lines existed mere meters apart. Still, it was something. Coordinate with von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4. I want continuous air presence during the next assault. If we're attacking with limited fuel, we'll need every possible advantage. The planning continued through the day. Staff officers calculated ammunition requirements, medical evacuation procedures, and contingency plans for various outcomes. The German military machine, even when hamstrung by logistics, remained professionally competent. But competence couldn't manufacture fuel, couldn't extend supply lines, and couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of distance and consumption. In the ranks, soldiers prepared for renewed assault with weary resignation. They had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries, and vast stretches of Russia. They had been told they were invincible, that German racial superiority guaranteed victory, that the Slavic subhumans would collapse before German will. But the Slavic subhumans were fighting with desperate ferocity. The easy victories were memories, and invincibility was a propaganda lie that died in burning tanks and ruined streets.